Now, for the rest of, for Janet and Vagabond, besides the actual reaction, your personal reaction to the actual defacing, I want you also to talk about the how important is preservation of art, you know, of the street art, especially in light of this. Okay. Janet?
Right, yep.
I think that the preservation of the city's murals is a really big deal. We are losing historic murals every day. They're being painted out, new buildings are going up. Some of that we can't stop. Buildings are going up next door to. Every time you see a mural that's got a parking lot in front of it, hold your breath. There's almost nothing left of murals from the 80s, sadly. There is a new national organization called Rescue Public Murals that is going to try and save and restore murals all over the country. The first one is going to be in New York. It's a pilot project. But the question of restoration has a great deal to do with how the community feels about their murals. Whether they're spray or paint, or whether graffiti artists and brush artists have worked together, and by the way, they really do. It really depends on the sponsoring organization and the community. And if we could get it together and really start pushing for preservation, these murals can be preserved, they can be restored. And I do not think it makes a difference in valuing a mural, whether it was done with a brush or done with a spray can. Most graffiti artists can wield a very mean brush. I know that from experience. I also know most brush artists are at a total loss with the spray can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Vagabond, as an artist, I want also your reaction, but also he has a book with him that we will pass around showing all of the murals that have been done in East Harlem and the beauty of them at their really, their best state. Vagabond?
Hi, I just wanted to talk for a minute. I'm always a person who's trying to look at things from a broader perspective. And one of the things that I've always felt about graffiti, well, I think when we're talking about graffiti here, we're talking about the modern day explosion that happened, that had its genesis in New York City in terms of graffiti, because graffiti, you know, goes back to cave paintings in France. Prehistoric times is people painting on walls. And so the graffiti that we're talking about, I guess today, is really concerned with the late 60s, early 70s explosion that begins then in New York City and sort of essentially changes the world as we know it today. I think there were arguments very early on about graffiti being, that graffiti artists who used to tag up their names were not political. And most graffiti throughout history has always been political. And then the New York City thing, a lot of people mistook it for not being political. And if you go throughout Latin America or even into Asia or Africa, there's a lot of the way that people who have no other means of expression express themselves is by painting on a wall, whether either with a paintbrush or an aerosol can or whatever the case may be. And so if you travel around the world or you just look on the internet, you'll see that all over the place. For me, the beginning of the graffiti movement, the modern day graffiti movement in New York City is political simply because towards the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, you have a collapse of the civil rights movement. There were all these promises that were made. Some of them came through, some of them didn't. And I think that the youth who were growing up in that time felt as though they were being forgotten. And so the psychological overall impetus to write your name up, to be all city, to get on a train, was to let people know that you existed. I mean, it was a very different time New York City was a different place at that time. You had ghettos that were essentially locked off from the rest of the city. You had people that lived in those ghettos and never left them unless they had a job and they were going somewhere. And so the youth start to want to let people know that they exist. And by doing graffiti on the trains, which went all around the city, it forced people to have to deal with these youth who everyone wanted to forget. And I think that part of the sadness of this all is that the recent situation with the mural on 104th Street is that still exists. That there are still, even though things on the surface look like they're changing, even though things look better in East Harlem, for a lot of people who have been here for a really long time, things have not changed. And so there are people who do want to let it be known that they exist and that they're here and that you, at some point, are going to have to deal with them. And so I'm trying to look at things from a sort of more a larger perspective, political perspective, in that the people who tag up their names don't want to be forgotten. I also believe that, for me, when I started doing graffiti, which was in the mid-'80s, for me, it was a way of seeing things. And this is, I think, one of the things that James is bringing out, is that graffiti for me was like you would see a wall. Some people see a wall, a graffiti artist sees a canvas, or some people see a fire hydrant, graffiti artist sees somewhere to put his name, or to put a piece of a character. And so what happens at that point is that you start to look at the world differently. You see the world differently, which is always a good thing. You start to see the possibilities in things. And for me, that's one of the things that I loved about graffiti. And I know that a lot of people who started off as graffiti artists who would never otherwise would never otherwise crack open a book about Picasso, all of a sudden, once they started to get into the graffiti thing and once they started to get into art, most graffiti artists know art history backwards and forwards. And they start to get into other things. And so it's an opportunity to let people, to open people's minds and open people's abilities into different things. And so the shame of it is that, especially what Janet was saying, is that there are no more places to do anything. The gentrification process is overwhelming, and the places to get up are becoming less and less and less and less and less. And so I think part of the situation with these kids who tagged up on the mural on 104th is that there's that squeeze. Everybody's being squeezed. There's no place to live. There's no place to do art. There's no place to park your car. There's no place to do anything. And maybe we need to take a look at some of those issues as well.
Okay.